Hey, it's Jared with Coda. In this video, I'm going to run through what we broke down in the last video in Notion and how we can start implementing that in sort of the boilerplate that we need to get going with those content types in Sanity. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and cd into the Studio directory and run Sanity start. Once that's compiled, we'll go ahead and open it up at localhost 3333. Now, we left in the first video of this kind of mini series, I guess, we left with a schema type called fast fact. I've already deleted that because that was really just sort of for maybe introduction or demonstration purposes. So that's here, we're just going to have an empty schema. A quick note would be to study up on the schema types in the Sanity documentation and start to get a feel for everything that's available to you out of the box in Sanity. And it's pretty typical for the most part of what you might expect to find in any data type. They kind of run off of basic primitives and things like that. To run through this list over here, you can see it's pretty typical data types if you've worked in a CMS before. You have things like arrays, blocks, booleans, dates, so on and so forth. And we're not going to go through every single one of those because that feels highly unproductive for what we actually need to do. But it is worth noting that their docs are really great, and the schema types page is something that I reference pretty often. So one thing to note is that I take sort of an opinionated approach to how I organize the schema. Now we're going to create a few directories just to get started and get us in the right direction for what I like to do. Now, there are things called documents, objects, and plugs. Now, this is a pattern found in a Gatsby and Sanity kitchen sink starter from the Sanity teams. And this is a pattern that I really liked when I saw it, and I've seen a few other people replicate it, and it's something that I like to continue doing. So documents are going to be sort of standalone pieces of data, or you could say that they are a content type, right? So you can have things like a page or a post, so on and so forth. You can also have things like singleton documents as a term. And those are things like an SEO settings document, for example, where you have a large global configuration and you need a standalone document for it, but there's only going to be one. It's not a collection. And that's something that you can do to define in the structure builder how that will actually look in the interface. But it is worth noting that that is another type of document that we'll probably get to at some point. The next thing is objects. And you can think of this in other content management systems. They might be called modules or partials or something like that, maybe an includes. These are things that are not going to be directly accessible as a standalone document or an actual independent object capable of reference and things like that. These are sort of the mix-ins of fields, if you will. So an example would be if you had maybe an open graph image on your page document that had a series of fields that were going to be repeated. You would have them kind of grouped together into one large object containing maybe an image, an alt text, description, so on and so forth. So that's sort of where I like to put those sorts of things, is in this objects directory. Lastly, we have plugs. And now these plugs are the things that you typically would think of as a module or a slice or a layout, all of the things that we blocked out in Figma as being maybe a hero or features or the social callout. Those things will all live here. And now obviously those will all end up in a page document. They just plug in to the page document. So when we create the page, for example, we will have an array of plugs. So to get started, there are a couple of things that I would note. I would just remind you that everything runs through this create schema function in your schema.js file. And so one thing that's kind of helpful to remember is that all of these things need to be exported and then imported in here properly. And now again, I have sort of opinionated approaches to these things. And so, for example, let's just go ahead and create the few plugs that we need for our landing page. So we have a hero, we have features, and we have social callout. And now we have these three things, and sometimes you can imagine when a website gets pretty big, you end up with a lot of plugs and objects and things like that. And so I'm sure you can anticipate you're going to end up with, 20, 30, 40 imports into your schema file. And so one way that I like to get around that is I just preemptively go ahead and create an index file where I will ultimately bubble up the exports for all of these different things. And so let's start with maybe the hero, for example. And so we need a default export, and we will say export default, and then we can move on and give this thing a name. And I actually lied. We're going to start with the title. And so if you remember back a couple of videos ago, or maybe you didn't watch it, I'm not your dad, the title is going to be the admin area's sort of label. And so we'll call this a hero, and the actual data name, when we reference this in GraphQL or in Grok, the query language from Sanity, it will be called name with a lowercase h. And then we will give it some fields. And now these fields are going to be an array of objects. And so the first thing that we defined, and I'll go ahead, I actually think I want to pull this up side by side with my list here. And so this is where the helpful planning comes in, because now that we have all of these data types planned out and we have a good idea ahead of time of what we want to create, we can just run through and literally have a checklist for what we need to do. And so for the fields on this, we need one with a title of heading and a name of heading, and that needs a type as well. And so that type is going to be a document. Actually, hang on, all right, I lied to you. That was really dumb. It is not a document. It is a string, obviously. I got sidetracked because mentally I was thinking that I forgot a type up here, and this is going to be an object. So when I put document down here, I was thinking about the hero. I was just getting ahead of myself. So we have a heading, and that is going to be of type string. And so now we can run back over here and we can check that off, and then we can create our next field. And now that we have that already defined, we know that that is just going to be called a subheading, and we want to give it a name of subheading and a type of string. And so these are, for now, all of the things that we are going to need in our hero plug. And so this is a default export, so we don't need to do anything else with this. However, it is not going to be available just yet if you were to head back over to our Sanity Studio. And there's a couple of reasons for that, actually. The primary reason is that we never imported it, right? We never came into our schema file and told it to be listed as a schema type. But the actual kind of underlying issue is that we actually are not going to be importing it directly in a way that we are going to see it in our actual admin area just yet. We will, however, once we get it into the page type of document, be able to start pulling those things in. So just to get the pattern down though, this hero is going to contain these things as default exports. Nailed it. All right, this is what we're gonna do. My bad. We have an export default as hero from hero. And so the reason that you have to call this in brackets default as is because this is a default export over here. And so I got kind of confused. I was doing a named export, but that kind of is what it is, whatever. So we're going to export that from the hero. And then when we come down into our actual schema file, then we don't have to individually import anything as plugs. All right, so we will import all as plugs from plugs. And so this prevents us from having to import hero and then social callout and features, and then that list just grows and grows and grows. This is a pattern that we can set up kind of from the get-go to get things moving as the schema grows. Now, the one slightly funky thing about this is that we need to be able to include all of them into this concatenation function, right? And so we've imported them, but we don't necessarily want to list them out. So kind of a programmatic approach to that is to drop in this here. And this is something that I kind of save and repeat. And I just kind of copy and paste this from project to project because it's a very repeated and predictable pattern, right? We need to import the plugs, and then we define a variable or a constant called all plugs, and that is just going to map over all of these objects, and then it is going to return them. And yeah, long story short, we just need to do that. And now everything that we register in this index as a default export is going to end up being concatenated into our schema. And now there is one maybe kind of weird thing about that, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But this is a nice way to start this pattern out. And so I'm going to go ahead and create these other content types off screen. You don't need to sit and watch that. Again, we've already kind of listed it out. There's nothing super interesting going on there. And then we will come back in the next video and start creating the documents that we need to pull all of these in and ultimately have the data ready to go in Sanity for access in Gatsby.